While humanity and our place in the world has changed over the generations, there's one part of our nature that has remained present. War and the reasons for it seem to reoccur unabated throughout our history, and it's only when looking back on the myriad of battles that you can see the patterns. These parallels can likewise be drawn when looking into the events of World War II and the build-up of distrust between not only the Axis and Allied sides of the conflict, but also between the countries found on either side of the metaphorical line in the sand. In this programme, we'll be investigating the build-up to the outbreak of the Second World War, and looking into what led to the alliance of Japan's Empire of the Rising Sun with Hitler's Nazi Germany. With the backdrop of growing tension between the world's many superpowers, we'll break down not only the immediate precursors to the war, but also the deep-seated distrust and historical prejudices that brought it about. Though before we get to dealing with the 20th century's part in this theatrical build-up of aggression, we must first take into account what brought the nations to this point, and how the many generations of humans that came before helped shape the climate that made the epic clash of so many countries possible. It's easy to look back at the past, study the history of war, and uncover dramatic reports of heroic exploits, daring deeds, evil megalomaniacs and vicious dictators, and all too soon you'll find yourself completely detached from such events. The turbulent wars that took place so long ago seem to have little connection with reality, and will, in point of fact, often be the stuff of legend. Whether you consider the conflicts of the ancient Greeks, the battles for Troy, or Alexander the Great's conquest for world domination, what we now know often owes more to movie makers of the more recent past's interpretations. War is about heroes, glory, and a rip-roaring story, and invariably the true horrors of human conflict are lost in the telling. What's more, the old adage that history is only ever written by the victors is extremely accurate, or it was, until the wider use of photography, developed through the course of the 20th century, painted a very different picture indeed. So to really understand the concept of war on a global scale, the World War II years of 1939 to 45 provide perhaps the first complete overview of man's inhumanity to man, alongside the bravery and heroism that show the very worst and the very best facets of human nature. Incredibly, there are archive images from every stage of this conflict, and as we consider the events of the Second World War chronologically, this series of programmes will build into the ultimate timeline. This is our past that we can truly connect with, revealing a history littered with living, breathing survivors who can still tell stories of the comradeship, hardship, suffering, and sadly on occasion, the futility of battle. However, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. To truly understand the events of the Second World War and its build-up, we need to look into some of the major events that led to its breakout. Perhaps the most influential, beyond all others, was the outcome and aftermath of the First World War. This conflict was a key point in not only Hitler's rise to power, but the rearmament of Germany and the beginning of tensions in the East. The First World War, spanning the years of 1914 to 1918, is often referred to as the Great War, although there was little that was great about it. was also called the War to End All Wars, which is rather a tragic misnomer with the benefit of hindsight. The figures for the casualties are staggering, with approximately 40 million people suffering injury on a very personal level, and at least half of these casualties proved to be fatal. This so-called Great War ended with an armistice at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, the 11th month, 1918, after which the defeated German Empire had its own internal revolution, leading to the end of the monarchy and the setting up of Germany as a republic. Even after the armistice was signed, the victorious forces still kept up their blockades around the country. This led to imports and exports being severely reduced, which did little to help Germany to rebuild itself. The next year, delegates from many countries arrived in Paris to discuss how to prevent a war of such scale from ever occurring again. While attempting to curb any possible resurgences of aggression in Germany, the group were also hoping to restore a sense of order and harmony to the world in the wake of the greatest loss of life their countries had ever seen. The official treaty that marked the ending of the First World War came a little while after the Paris Peace Conference and formed the backbone of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles was drawn up by the victorious Allies and signed by all parties on June 28, 1919. But many historians believe that this well-intentioned treaty actually did more to cause a Second World War rather than prevent it. Signed in Versailles' magnificent Hall of Mirrors, the only country not allowed to take part in the process was Germany. The repercussions and heavy penalties imposed were therefore unworkable and would create a national feeling of resentment and revenge. It was this lack of foresight that eventually would allow the extremist views of Adolf Hitler to not only be listened to, but also acted upon. But Germany weren't the only people feeling that dissatisfied with the outcome. Italy too felt that they deserved more for their efforts in the war. Japan's Empire of the Rising Sun was angered that they didn't receive parts of China in recompense. With hindsight, it is clear to see that this was the beginning of the Axis alliance, as those feeling most left out when it came to the treaty banded together. Matters were made much worse because Germany was also forced to accept sole responsibility for the conflict, pay huge sums of money to the Allied nations for the damage that the war had caused, and relinquish land to specific ethnic groups to form new countries. Part of the deal also required Germany to disband the military, and the manufacture of any armaments was prohibited. For a proud nation with a distinguished tradition of empire building, the treaty added insult to injury. And as the history books tell, an agreement of any kind will only ever hold if all parties involved have something to gain from adhering to it, and feel that whether victor or loser, justice has been done. At the end of the First World War, most nations who'd been involved and their citizens developed a pacifist mentality, never wanting to experience the horrors of war again. However, there were those, sadly, who had been inspired by the experience, and two of the most famous of these men were Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. With equally distorted views and a distinct fondness for fascism, they posed a danger to the much longed-for idea of world peace, and neither of them would waste any time rising to power. In 1919, it was generally assumed that all European states would in future be democratic in structure, and therefore sufficiently like-minded and peace-loving to make the machinery of the League of Nations work effectively. But this was to prove far more of a dream than a reality. Alongside the soon-to-be fascist dictatorships brewing in Germany and Italy, there was another nation beyond the horizon that had similar conquest-centric ambitions. Japan was a proud militaristic nation, and their leaders had had their eyes on resource-rich China for a long time, though there were certain other nations to take into consideration when musing on the concept of invasion. The Japanese had a history of disputes with America and Russia, and having spent many centuries of its existence with its ports closed to the outside world, it was a nation of great mystery. When the American naval commodore, Admiral Matthew Perry, finally forced the Japanese to open up trading links with the West, as the 19th century drew to a close, the Empire of the Rising Sun, without doubt, felt they were being taken advantage of. What's more, with America buying the vast expanses of Alaska from the Russians and winning the Philippine Islands and Guam from the Spanish, Japan was all too aware of the growing dominance of the USA. Hawaii was also annexed, with the Americans creating a naval base there from which they could easily reach their newly acquired territory in the Pacific. As the long-range combat abilities of the 20th century were realised in the latter parts of the First World War, Japan felt increasingly vulnerable to the fast growth of the other great world powers, pushing for the rapid development of their own high-tech navy and air force that would soon match anything found in the factories of the most technologically advanced nations. However, their plans hit a substantial roadblock at the end of the First World War, the signing of several military reduction treaties. After bitter and bloody fighting in the trenches and great battles at sea, when peace eventually prevailed in 1918, treaties were fast put in place to prevent such a war ever breaking out again. But just as the Treaty of Versailles and its draconian measures against the defeated German nation fired Adolf Hitler and other like-minded patriots into action, another treaty caused discontent for the Japanese. The strength of the largest naval powers in the world came under close scrutiny in the aftermath of World War I, and the Washington Naval Treaty was signed between America, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, agreeing limits for each signatory's navy. However, the Japanese felt they had been unfairly constrained by the Americans, and it was the start of a period of conflict between the two culturally diverse nations. The signing of this document would see the Japanese Prime Minister, Prince Fuminara Konoe, state that due to his nation being resource poor, that they would have no resort but to destroy the status quo for the sake of self-preservation. Within a decade, the fragile foundations of peace that the Treaty of Versailles had attempted to construct were under threat, and Konoe's predictions were to become reality. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the world spiralling into an economic depression, and Japan was forced to look further afield for supplies of raw materials to feed the country's dying economy. Over the next 8 years, the rest of the world watched as Japan invaded massive parts of China, specifically Manchuria. The attack and subsequent occupation of the country would eventually see Japan leaving the League of Nations on poor terms with its one-time allies. It was at this stage in the closing days of 1937 that the first real confrontation between America and Japan would set them up for the conflicts to come. While the Japanese were conducting their invasion of the Chinese capital Nanjing, an American gunboat, the USS Panay, attempted to evacuate military and civilian personnel. It was promptly attacked and sunk by the invading Rising Sun forces. This open demonstration of hostility gave the American president every reason to go to war, but with national sentiment still behind their isolationist principles, he declined to intervene fully. Meanwhile, many Japanese expressed remorse at the incident, one of whom wielded considerable government influence. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto made a formal apology to the United States for the Panay incident. He was a Harvard man who'd spent time as a naval attaché in America and was well aware of the considerable naval power that America wielded. He was also more aware than anyone else of the dangers of going to war with a nation as powerful as the United States. To the relief of the Japanese government on Christmas Eve 1937, the president accepted the apology from Tokyo, but while the war continued in China, Roosevelt was increasingly disturbed by the tales of atrocities filtering back to the West. The Japanese military had little respect for human life, and their use of biological weapons and terror bombing was killing millions of civilians throughout China. After the Japanese firebombed Chongqing in May 1939, killing 5,000 people in 2 days, America made decisive moves towards preventing further Japanese brutality. Nevertheless, the battle between China and Japan was prolonged and brutal, and by 1940 still showed no sign of coming to a close. By now, the Japanese had seized territory on the south coast of China, cutting the provisional capital Chongqing off from the sea. It was becoming increasingly difficult for aid to get through. Only a few tenuous supply routes were left, and Tokyo's generals were eager that they be cut off as soon as possible, so that the battle for southern China could be swiftly won. One of these routes was the Burma Road, which ran from Lashio in the north of British-controlled Burma to the Chinese city of Kunming, and Japan demanded that Churchill have it closed with immediate effect. Britain was in a difficult and vulnerable position, as some of its most valuable colonies, including Hong Kong and Singapore, were in the Far East, and with the Battle of Britain in full swing, couldn't afford to spare precious ships for their defence. Japan certainly seemed to have the upper hand, already having taken advantage of the Germans' victory in France by putting pressure on French Indochina to close their routes into China, and it appeared that the British were now equally helpless to protect their interests. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had a grave decision to make, and for the time being at least, he had no other options open, forcing him to reluctantly agree to Japanese demands. On July the 17th, the Burma Road was temporarily closed, amid cries of shame from the politicians in the House of Commons. And while these events were taking place, in Africa yet another belligerent was making his presence felt. Elsewhere in the world, the threat of fascism and tyranny was spreading at an alarming rate. By September the 13th, Mussolini had revived his invasion plans in North Africa and ordered the Italian 10th Army to advance on Egypt. Within 2 weeks, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese had invaded French Indochina and were ready to agree a formal alliance with Nazi Germany. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, then commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, was particularly concerned about the Italian naval presence in the Mediterranean and planned an attack which would eventually become known as Operation Judgment. Although the offensive had been postponed when Neville Chamberlain, then Prime Minister, appeared to have averted war with Germany, by 1940, preparations for the Taranto attack were once more underway, and by the autumn of 1940, when General Graziani brought his troops to a halt at Sidi Barrani and British ships were freed up for action, the Allies seized the opportunity to strike. As Hitler moved inexorably towards a showdown with his nemesis, the Soviet Union, and 1940 drew to a close, On the 29th of December, President Roosevelt delivered one of his famous fireside chats to the American public. The speech marked a definite decline in the isolationist policy of the United States, and it seemed that American intervention was approaching ever closer. While more nations had been drawn to the side of the Axis, Roosevelt warned the Americans of the risks that the tripartite pact posed, describing it as an unholy alliance of power to dominate and to enslave the human race. Japan at this time was in the midst of a long and brutal war with China, and had already used the weakened position of the Western empires to their advantage. In 1940, Tokyo officials pressured French Indochina to close some of the few routes left which were being used to transport valuable aid into China. Adolf Hitler realized that America's days for neutrality were coming to an end, although the United States had not yet made a declaration of war. Nevertheless, Hitler now had powerful allies, and his treaty with the Japanese would prove to be of great use. Spies from the country were already surveying the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, and by the end of 1941, as relations deteriorated between Washington and Tokyo, the Japanese would launch a devastating attack, not only Pearl Harbor, but American bases around the Pacific, crippling their fleet for a time. Attacking the Soviets proved to be a huge error on the part of the German Führer, who had vastly underestimated the strength of his enemy. What's more, any hopes he had of his Japanese allies attacking Russia from the east, as the Nazis advanced from the west, was soon dashed, as the Empire of the Rising Sun became rather more preoccupied with their ongoing war with China, and awakening a sleeping giant of their own, namely the United States of America. On the 2nd of June 1941, an imperial conference was held in Japan as Hitler's most powerful ally evaluated their position. With Operation Barbarossa putting Russia and Germany at war, the Japanese were reluctant to be drawn into the conflict as they had issues of their own that demanded more immediate attention. Since they'd been at war since 1937, Japan was substantially committed in Southeast Asia, which could have proved a useful springboard for attacking further north into Russian territory. As time went on, though, it became clear that the ambitions of the Japanese leaders lay with their long-term enemies, the Americans. With the growing tension between their leaders and soldiers, it wouldn't be long before even these isolationist nations were drawn into the conflict that would consume the world over a long 6-year period. While the US had been pushed by the eastern arm of the Axis alliance, it would take one large-scale assault before the American populace and their politicians decided it was time to take action. Lightning strike against the Hawaiian Navy base of Pearl Harbor. In a conflict that spanned 6 years of strife and aggression across many continents and a multitude of countries, the Second World War can certainly be said to have contained critical junctures, events that changed the course of the conflict dramatically. Europe had its Battle of Britain and Operation Barbarossa, while America's were Pearl Harbour and the following Battle for Midway. Each of these events were ultimately tipping points, the straw on the back of each side's war effort, creating tremendous repercussions. One of the most monumental was Japan's sneak attack on the American naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbour, which not only declared the Empire of the Rising Sun's position to the world, highlighting their alliance with Nazi Germany, but also awoke a nation to their place in the conflict, washing away a deep-seated isolationism that had kept the US out of the war to date. After the devastation of their navy at Pearl Harbour, President Roosevelt had the backing of the people, and simply no option but to bring the slumbering giant of their military might into play, their first target being those that perpetrated the attack, the Japanese. However, the build-up to such turning points is almost if not more important than the events themselves. To understand the reason for the attack on the American naval base and what led to it, we need to look back at Japan's invasion of neighbouring China and its dealings with other allied nations, most notably Great Britain. At this time in history, the UK held a lot of territory in the Far East, which they were keen to protect. Unfortunately, this led to an appeasement strategy being put in place, similar to the tack taken with Hitler and his European troop movements. Malaya, Burma, Singapore and Hong Kong were all precious British colonies, and these lay vulnerable to attack while Japan remained allied with Germany. The Japanese had already put pressure on Britain to close the Burma Road, one of the few routes left open to deliver aid to China, and it was clear that as the war continued against Germany, the might of the British Empire was diminishing considerably in the region. The Japanese, in the meantime, remained sceptical about their alliance with Adolf Hitler. As a member of the Tripartite Pact, Japanese politicians had been shocked that Germany had not informed them of the attack on the Soviet Union, which put them in an awkward position after their agreement with Stalin. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, was quick to side with Hitler. Dismissing his earlier treaty with the Soviet leader, now urged Japan to go to war with Russia from the east as Germany advanced across its borders from the west. The government were by now exasperated with their foreign minister and keen to be rid of him. So, Prime Minister Konoe, along with the entire cabinet, resigned in July 1941 to be reformed into a new government without him. But although Matsuoka's absence was a relief to many in Tokyo, Konoe was wary that Japan was moving rapidly towards the brink of a war which would soon be unavoidable. The Eastern Empire had already been spreading propaganda in support of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere to rally support for its venture to the South Pacific. The The government claimed that this enterprise would place the people of Southeast Asia and China under the protection of Japan. Western empires had long taken advantage of the wealth of the Pacific, and Japan would now free Asia from European and American imperialism. But while those in the Pacific Islands began to truly believe that the Empire of the Rising Sun would be their salvation, the co-prosperity sphere was no more than an excuse for aggressive military expansionism. In early July, American intelligence picked up a message from an imperial conference held in Japan, which stated that preparation for a southward advance should be reinforced. By July the 18th, it was clear that Japan was preparing to venture further afield. This was something that the US didn't wish to happen, as they had territory of their own in the Philippines and Guam, which they were keen to protect. As a warning to the growing ambition of their Japanese neighbours across the water, the American military stepped up their presence in the area. With the influx of men into the American forces during the next year, further moves were made by the US to halt Japanese expansionism. In the summer of 1941, the White House decided to freeze Japanese assets so they could no longer purchase oil in America. With 80% of their oil imports being met by the United States, this was disastrous news for the Japanese. Emperor Hirohito was informed that the nation's oil stockpiles would be completely depleted within 2 years, which in turn of course meant the Japanese military machine would no longer be able to function. Matters deteriorated for the Japanese yet again when they saw British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet America's President Roosevelt on a warship anchored off Newfoundland to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific in August 1941. This gave rise to the treaty known as the Atlantic Charter, and advocated freedom from want and fear, the disarmament of aggressor nations, and stated that all people had a right to self-determination. To the West, this was a blueprint for the brave new world that the Allies prayed would emerge after the war had ended. But to the Japanese, it was a blueprint for Anglo-American world domination, and even a formal declaration of war couldn't have been more provocative. Over the coming year, relations between America and Japan became even more strained, with the empire's Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe repeatedly attempting to negotiate some sort of deal due to dwindling oil supplies. However, Roosevelt refused to meet with him until they'd pulled their forces out of China. Feeling unable to do this, and angered at his lack of ability to negate the impending conflict with the US, Konoe eventually resigned, leaving his country's leadership open to much more aggressive intentions, spearheaded by the strong personalities found at the head of the military. Throughout history, the Japanese were renowned for their fierce fighting, and had once been led by samurai warriors who instilled the idea of Bushido, or freedom from fear, in their soldiers. A true Japanese warrior should have no fear of death, pain or defeat, and no regard for himself, with his only purpose being to serve his master. But even with this extraordinary fearlessness instilled in the population, the fight ahead was going to be challenging. The United States had built up immense naval fleets and armies, and would be a formidable opponent. The admiral of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, was well aware of what the country was up against, and knew that to begin a war with America, the Imperial Army would have to do a great deal more than simply seize their outposts. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University, as well as spending time serving as a naval attaché in America. And he was one of the few Japanese commanders who really understood the immense naval power of the USA. And he told his government in no uncertain terms what was required. It is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. But despite his well-founded concerns about picking a fight with such a powerful nation as America, Yamamoto was loyal to his empire and dutifully began searching for the best way to overcome the US Navy. One tactic that he'd observed in the past would turn out to be a major inspiration for Pearl Harbor. In October 1940, the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto had utilised torpedoes that were especially developed to work in shallow water. It was after this that Yamamoto realised a surprise attack on America would be far more effective than allowing them to respond directly in a straight shootout, crippling it before it could set sail for the Pacific theatre at all. In the spring of 1941, Japanese carrier pilots began training in the special tactics that would be essential in the attack plan, which would target Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. By the autumn, as Tojo took on the role of Prime Minister, Yamamoto saw that there was now no turning back. At the beginning of November, he assigned Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commander of the mission and set a date for the planned attack, December the 7th, 1941. Earlier, back in Washington, President Roosevelt was concerned about deteriorating relations with Japan and the risk this posed to American territory in the Pacific, and had elected to move the American fleet from its base in California to Hawaii, where it would be closer to the Pacific arena. Here, on the largest island of the archipelago at Pearl Harbor, the sailors soaked up the sun and enjoyed the beaches, with little idea that they were far closer to the troubles brewing overseas than they could possibly have imagined. As training and preparation of the Japanese forces continued leading up to the attack, a charade of diplomacy was continued, helping bolster the already heavy secrecy being employed by the Empire in regards to their impending strike. On the 20th of November, the Japanese ambassador to the US presented Japan's final ultimatum to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, demanding a resumption of oil supplies to Japan and the cessation of aid to China. Hull refused, reiterating the US position that Japan should withdraw all troops from the region and cease their invasion. With negotiations coming to a close, on November the 26th, 1941, the Japanese task force, comprising of 6 aircraft carriers accompanied by 24 supporting vessels, departed from Tankan Bay in the Kurile Islands in the strictest secrecy. Keeping radio silence to avoid detection, they crossed the North Pacific, avoiding the normal shipping lanes as they headed towards their destination 200 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was from here that the attack on Pearl Harbor would be launched. Due to diligent code breaking, the Allies had an inkling of an attack, but it was unknown from what direction it would come. With the breakdown of relations with the US, it was assumed it would be directed at them, but when or where Japan would make its move was anyone's guess. While the British and Americans watched for the first signs of belligerence from the Far East, in Nazi Germany, officials were jubilant about the prospect of a Japanese attack on Allied territory. The German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop had assured the Japanese ambassador in Berlin that Hitler would support its tripartite pact ally and declare war as soon as Japan went to war with the United States. Tokyo had in turn informed Germany that the time of this war may come quicker than anyone dreams. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life went on as normal. American sailors were ashore, enjoying their tropical paradise as they played football or golf. And on the night of December the 6th, as sailors relaxed in the bars and clubs, many were dancing to the sounds of the Navy's musicians in a battle of the fleet dance bands. Staying up until the early hours, few would be prepared for the onslaught that lay ahead. But as night gave way to day, the first warning signs were breaking over the horizon. Some of them were diplomatic in nature, with a coded 13-part message being delivered by the Japanese government addressing their rejection of Secretary Hull's proposal. However, there was a crucial 14th part, which wasn't delivered until the morning of the attack. At 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, December the 7th, Japanese midget submarines stealthily entered through the harbour gates, but though they were spotted, no general alarm was given. Back in Washington, the tension was building as General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's military advisor, had received the decoded 14th part of the message from Tokyo. It confirmed that negotiations with Japan had ended, and realizing the potential implications, the US War Department immediately sent an alert to Pearl Harbor. But problems with radio communications would delay the message, and tragically, the vital warning would arrive too late. While Washington was aware that hostilities were about to commence, on the other side of the Pacific, events were gathering pace as Japanese ships loaded with 5,000 troops from the war-torn battlefields of China approached British-controlled Malaya. Soon soldiers were storming onto the beaches and onto Allied territory, and the war on the West had begun. While the fury of the Japanese military was unleashed in the Pacific, radio transmissions between the Japanese carrier fleet near Hawaii and Tokyo ceased, and at 6:15 a.m., Vice Admiral Nagumo gave the order to release the planes. As the aircraft carriers pitched and rolled on the stormy seas, the first wave of 183 fighters, bombers and torpedo planes, commanded by Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, took to the sky. The vast formation included bombers which would target the battleships and aircraft carriers, followed by dive bombers to attack the land-based aircraft and hangars at Ford Island and Wheeler Field. Then came the Japanese fighter aircraft, assigned the task of destroying the planes on the airfields before they could take off and defend the harbour. Using music from a Honolulu radio station as a guiding beam to navigate, the enemy planes began to close in on their target. The fact that this music was playing gave the Japanese a great indication of how effective their stealth tactics had been. The American forces were completely unprepared for the attack that was about to commence. Just before 8 a.m, the first Japanese assault waves darkened the skies, sending the US military personnel that were awake into a frenzy of activity. Commander Logan C. Ramsey at the command center on Ford Island sounded the alert. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. While the Japanese fighter planes began to swoop over Hickam and Wheeler airfields, rallying to the battle cries of Commander Fuchida. The Americans, believing there was no imminent threat, had made little effort to prepare themselves for attack, and the aircraft were neatly parked out in the open, wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition lockers were locked, and even the guns that could have provided some protection against the aerial onslaught were unmanned. There weren't even any torpedo nets to protect the American battleships, and as waves of bombers began to close in on the fleet, the torpedoes, developed to slice through the shallow depths of Pearl Harbor, devastated one target after the other. Of the more than 90 ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor, the main objective of the Japanese had been to strike the vessels moored on Battleship Row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. As tornadoes screamed through the air, hitting their targets with precision, the men aboard awoke to a tumult of smoke, fire, and deafening explosions. The battleships had little chance to defend themselves, and within the first minutes of the attack, all of the 7 anchored along the shore had been bombed or torpedoed. 2 sank, while the USS Arizona exploded in a giant ball of flames after an armor-piercing shell ignited the ship's forward ammunition magazine. It was the largest loss of life on any ship that day, with the crew of this particular vessel making up 50% of the casualties suffered by the US throughout the entire assault. As the naval base was thrown into pandemonium, 30 minutes after the first attack, there was a short lull in the furious onslaught before a second wave of Japanese planes appeared over the harbour. By now, all around Pearl Harbor, civilians who had first thought the explosions were part of military maneuvers quickly became aware that they were under attack. The element of surprise had passed, however, and the US troops were now well aware of what they were facing. Anti-aircraft fire began to fight off the attacks, and some sailors even turned to machine guns and pistols as they battled desperately against the hail of missiles from the sky. Many heroes would emerge on this historical day, and one of those who fought bravely to defend the naval base was Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia. Despite having no training, he seized one of the anti-aircraft guns and began firing at Japanese planes until there was no ammunition left. But despite the bravery of Miller and all those fighting off the onslaught, the casualties suffered by Nagumo's pilots would be few compared to the devastating losses of the Americans. By 10 a.m, as the skies over the Hawaiian harbour fell silent 2 hours after the initial attack had begun, a trail of destruction lay around Pearl Harbor. As nurses and doctors rushed to tend the wounded, it was clear that the US fleet had been dealt a devastating blow. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed, including a number of civilians. Over 21 ships had been sunk or disabled, and almost 200 aircraft were destroyed, while over 150 were damaged as they stood on the ground. Virtually none had been able to take off to defend the base. However, the attack was not as devastating as it could have been. Despite the massive loss of life and material that the US Navy suffered, there were many small victories found within the greater battle. Admiral Yamamoto's failure to launch a third strike, due to fears of further losses, allowed most of the ships on Battleship Row to be salvaged, meaning they could return to war service within months, eventually taking the fight directly to the Japanese. On top of this, 3 US aircraft carriers weren't in the port as expected on that fateful day. They were in fact delivering aircraft to Wake Island, 250 miles west of Hawaii, leaving the American Navy far more capable than the Japanese had expected, despite the devastation of their initial raids. While the American people had maintained their hopes of staying out of the European war, as it was often thought of, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt finally had the backing of the people. On December the 8th, 1941, as crowds gathered outside the White House, the moment the Allies had been waiting for had come. President Roosevelt made an address, which was broadcast around the world, and the global conflict was now truly underway.
We will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
With Pearl Harbor igniting the fire in the belly of the beast that was the United States military, World War II had made its way to the Pacific, bringing in more parties to the bloody struggle and creating a whole new theatre of conflict. Following on from their surprise attack on the Hawaiian port, Japan's rapid expansion was continuing unabated, with invasions pushing quickly forward into the British-controlled colonies of Hong Kong, Malaya and Singapore, leaving their soldiers confident and battle-hardened. As the fighting continued throughout the early parts of 1942, the Empire of the Rising Sun expanded their defensive perimeter towards Australia. In the northeast, they began closing in on US territory. In these months, Japan saw their greatest victories and the Allies' many losses. But while it was a dominant period for the Imperial forces, it was also the beginning of the end, as it saw the Allied armies gradually increasing their levels of resistance to a point that the Axis enemies could not stand up to. While the window of opportunity before the US rebuilt their navy was exploited by the Empire to indiscriminately bomb and shell Allied fortifications and citadels, their first point of attack was Hong Kong, which fell to Axis troops on Christmas Day 1941. The Allies garrisoned there had held on longer than anyone had expected. Though surrender had been inevitable, 6,000 troops held off 40,000 enemy for several weeks. The Japanese campaign in Burma took much longer. Burma was a prize highly sought. It provided the British with a gateway to India, the jewel in the colonial crown. What's more, since 1938, the Burma Road that ran from Mandalay to Kunming had been the only overland supply route for the nationalist forces fighting the Japanese in China. With China joining the Allies and declaring war on Germany, Italy and Japan, the American General Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe as he was known, joined the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek as his chief of staff. Though they were successful in repulsing a Japanese attack in China on January the 15th, their success was short-lived. The Japanese were already in Burma. They did not let the dense jungle hinder their ambitions. Where roads were blocked, they simply took to the undergrowth. British-trained Burmese forces were unable to halt their advance. In the Commonwealth of the Philippines, the Allied forces were commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The Philippines had been officially made a territory of the United States as far back as 1902. However, despite their firm entrenchment in the locale, American forces found holding on to this colony far from easy. Defending the thousands of islands that comprised the Philippines was a nightmare. They lay 8,000 miles from the American west coast, but only 200 miles from Japanese-held Formosa. To defend them, General MacArthur had the equivalent of 2 divisions of regular troops, 16,000 US regulars and 12,000 Philippine scouts. Add to this the fact that in the months leading up to war, days were calm and languid, with social events dominating the agenda, leaving troops and equipment in anything but top-notch condition. As the conflict wore on, though, these weren't the only problems. There was too little food, too little ammunition. Sickness and malnutrition set in. The American Filipino force, racked by dysentery and malaria, continued to fight, but disease and lack of proper sustenance claimed more lives than the enemy. After 2 weeks hard fighting, the American and Filipino troops withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula on the west side of Manila Bay. There, MacArthur could pursue a strategy of defence and delay, shortening his lines and using the mountainous, jungle-covered terrain to his advantage. Furthermore, he could deny the Japanese the use of Manila as a port. Perhaps he could even hold out long enough for a relief force to be mounted in the United States. But it wasn't just bullets and shells the Allies were faced with. The Japanese launched a propaganda war in the skies over the Philippines, dropping thousands of leaflets on Allied troops, insisting they had no hope pressing for their surrender. But there was no capitulation. By March, it was clear that relief from the United States main forces would not be coming. MacArthur was given the order by President Roosevelt to leave the islands and take command of operations in the Southwest Pacific. He begrudgingly complied. Despite this, though, the beleaguered remaining forces held on for several months after MacArthur's departure, with his final words becoming a rallying cry for all those left behind: "I shall return." However, his leaving the embattled island was anything but easy. On March the 12th, he boarded a motor torpedo boat under new orders to take command of the communication lines between Australia and America that were now coming under threat. From his boat, MacArthur boarded a plane for Darwin. His B-17 Flying Fortress staggered into the air from Del Monte Airfield, Mindanao, with one engine spluttering. The 5-hour flight took him and his staff over the captured enemy islands of the Celebes, Timor, and the northern part of New Guinea. Somehow, they managed to avoid enemy Zero fighters. As they finally reached Darwin, they found that it was under Japanese attack, so they diverted to Batchelor Airfield, about 50 miles away. When they eventually disembarked from the aircraft, a weary MacArthur remarked, "It was close, but that's the way it is in war. You win or lose, live or die, and the difference is just an eyelash." Some US Navy officers had given MacArthur only a 1 in 5 chance of escaping the Philippines. via the radio airwaves, Tokyo Rose had boasted that the Japanese would capture him. But MacArthur and his family made it out. It was from this new Australian base that he would conduct the next phase of operations. However, the Philippines wasn't the only Southeast Asian battleground to see heavy combat between the Japanese and Allied forces. Elsewhere, Imperial expansion had been just as aggressive, fueled by several factors, the most important of them being their dwindling stockpile of oil. These had been cut off by the US when the Empire had invaded China, causing potential supply problems in the not-too-distant future. They needed oil to keep the war machine turning, and the best way for them to get it now was to take over the West East Indies, their next target. Japanese troops had first landed in Sumatra early February. Despite a valiant defence by the local populace, along with Dutch and British soldiers, Java fell in early March. Continuing their advance through this region, Imperial forces were also making their way across the jungles of Malaya to another important target, Singapore. The British had been in residence since 1819, when Sir Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles founded a trading post there. It soon became a valuable British outpost, and Singapore's rapid growth and importance to the British East India Company ensured that the British were there to stay. In 1824, the status of Singapore as a British possession was cemented in an Anglo-Dutch treaty that divided the Malay archipelago between the two colonial powers, the British controlling the area north of the Straits of Malacca, including Penang, Malacca and Singapore, whilst the area south of the Straits was assigned to the Dutch. In 1940, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill had been responsible for Singapore's defences. He was convinced that should the island be attacked, it would be by sea. He informed his cabinet colleagues that Singapore is a fortress armed with 5 15-inch guns and garrisoned by 20,000 men. It could only be taken after a siege by an army of at least 50,000. Furthermore, he noted that Singapore was as far from Japan as New York was from Southampton. He thought it impossible to maintain men and munitions over such a distance. He also didn't consider it plausible at that time that the Japanese, who he described as a prudent people, would extend themselves beyond the Yellow Sea and China, where they were already occupied. Surely they would not embark on so mad an enterprise so far from home. Churchill was wrong. To combat the expected sea-based Japanese force, he dispatched 2 battleships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The Prince was a King George V class battleship which had a brief but active career, its hand in the sinking of the Bismarck being the highlight of its war service. HMS Repulse was a renowned class battlecruiser, the second to last battlecruiser built. She too had taken part in the chase of the Bismarck. The Admiralty had planned for an aircraft carrier to accompany the 2 ships, but the action never materialised. HMS Repulse left Singapore in company with HMS Prince of Wales and 4 destroyers to try and intercept the Japanese invasion convoys heading towards Malaya. But their hunt for invasion forces proved fruitless, and they turned south. It was at this point that Japanese aircraft were spotted. The fleet was attacked by 86 planes. Without the protection of an aircraft carrier, the ships were very vulnerable. The force the British thought to be an unsinkable deterrent was sunk, leaving the coast of Malaya exposed. General Yamashita could now make a move. His assault on Singapore would be down through Malaya and as the British had been slow to send troops north from Singapore, Malaya was badly defended. The assortment of untrained pilots and inferior Allied equipment in Malaya, Borneo and Singapore at that time were no match for the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. Their fighter aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, were instrumental in achieving air superiority. It wasn't long before Allied forces began falling back. After a 54-day campaign against Japanese troops, they could no longer hold back the tide, and the Axis soldiers began a steady march that was closing in on Singapore. The defence of this colony lay under the command of Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who'd roughly 100,000 military personnel from Australia, Great Britain and India at his disposal. This was more than 3 times that of the opposing Japanese commander, General Yamashita. Later in life, Yamashita would recall his thoughts on his invasion plan and what a nervous time it was for him and his men. My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked. I had 30,000 men and was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. I knew that if I had to fight for long for Singapore, I would be beaten. That is why the surrender had to be at once. I was very frightened all the time that the British would discover our numerical weakness and lack of supplies and force me into disastrous street fighting. The Japanese strategy was a wily one. At midnight on the 7th of February, Japanese troops landed unopposed on Singapore's northeast coast, and they gave the impression of an impending attack from that direction. However, the next day, they began a strategic air and artillery attack on the northwest coast instead. By 9:30 that night, the first Japanese amphibious assault on Singapore was launched. Undeterred by heavy casualties suffered from Australian machine gunners, wave upon wave of Japanese troops landed successfully. By midnight, the Australian defence was broken. Despite a clever plan to turn the naval defence guns against the invading Japanese, casualties on the Imperial side remained low, as the only rounds available were armour-piercing, designed to puncture ship hulls. If high-explosive shells had been to hand, the outcome of this invasion may have been a lot different. With his troops well established on the northern shores, Yamashita's next objective was Bukit Timah, commanding the northwestern approach to Singapore town. Yamashita called upon Percival to surrender, but Percival had strict orders to fight till the end. A bitter battle was fought where the Japanese 18th Division faced the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Malay Regiment, supported by men from the Australian forces. The Allies fought stubbornly and kept the Japanese onslaught at bay until the midnight of 12th of February. But as the odds grew too great, the Malay Regiment retreated. Up on Bukit Chandu, Allied soldiers ran out of ammunition but refused to give up. They engaged the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat, but it was no use. By the afternoon of 14th of February, Bukit Chandu was taken. By this time, the Japanese advance had forced British troops to fall back to a perimeter around the municipality. This was their last defence. Around this, the Japanese converged. The end was imminent. With water supplies falling to critical levels along with the last reserves of food, ammunition and fuel, General Arthur Percival made the decision to surrender the island to General Yamashita. He did so in an abandoned Ford motor factory with a final message to his superiors stating, all ranks have done their best. The creation of an East Asian co-prosperity sphere, free from the shackles of the Western empires, had long been the desire of those ruling Japan. By April 1942, it seemed that the empire of the rising sun was vaster than it had ever been before. The war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific had been highly successful, and the Japanese were now in control of the most strategically important parts of the Chinese coast and had occupied Malaya, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies and most of Burma. In the Pacific they held Wake Island, New Britain, the Gilbert Islands and Guam, and while the drive to seize new territory continued, the outlook was grim for the Allies. In the first few months of the war with Japan, valuable British and American outposts had swiftly fallen to the invading forces, and thousands of people were now prisoners of war, helplessly caught behind enemy lines. Even Singapore, once regarded an impregnable British fortress, had been crushed by the Japanese, dealing a devastating blow to Allied commanders. America, in the meantime, had lost valuable military bases and would soon lose its foothold in the precious Philippine Islands. With the main Allied naval forces in the area destroyed by the unhindered Japanese Air Force and surrounding territories almost entirely under Imperial control, troops at General MacArthur's old command didn't have much hope of victory. When the Japanese launched their new air and artillery assault, breaking through Allied defences, the men who were worn out from malnutrition, sickness and combat fatigue were too weak to counterattack and surrendered. Some of the Allied servicemen managed to escape to Corregidor Island to the south of Bataan, but battalions of Japanese infantry swiftly moved in and pushed the defenders back to Malinta Hill. To the despair of all those left fighting, the American flag was soon lowered, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who'd taken over from General MacArthur, had no choice but to accept General Masahiro Homa's terms of surrender. As a result, by May 8, 1942, the Philippines had been officially lost. But there was an even greater tragedy for the Allies to face as the Philippines fell. The Japanese had captured 80,000 Allied prisoners, all of whom needed to be transported to prison camps, and faced with such a huge task, it was decided they should walk 60 miles to a railhead at San Fernando. What was soon dubbed the Bataan Death March began on April the 10th, and it proved to be a terrible ordeal for the men who were already malnourished and sick. Thousands lost their lives as a result of exhaustion, hunger, dehydration and sickness, while many others were brutally murdered by their captors. It was a stark warning that going to war with Japan would be costly in terms of casualties, as the POWs were treated with bitter contempt by the Japanese soldiers, who regarded surrender as dishonourable. While the American war machine was still recovering from its blow at Pearl Harbor, it had begun to get back on its feet and was preparing for the next round. As news of the treatment of the men at Bataan reached the US, the public were galvanized beyond their already patriotic state. The resolve of the Allies to crush the Japanese was now more determined than ever, and President Roosevelt had already set in motion plans to strike at the very heart of Japan by bombing its capital city, Tokyo. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had been keen to restore public morale. In light of the later events in the Philippines, he was now eager to demonstrate to the Americans and the people of Japan that the Empire of the Rising Sun was not invulnerable to attack. On top of this, since Pearl Harbor, Japanese descendant immigrants were being treated with heavy suspicion. Many items of contraband were seized from anyone described as an enemy alien. This included shortwave radios, cameras, binoculars, and various weapons such as hunting knives and the dynamite used by farmers to clear land. Los Angeles Congressman Leland Ford wrote, "I do not believe that we could be any too strict in our consideration of the Japanese in the face of the treacherous way in which they do things." With the full backing of the American people and their governmental system, the American military were finally gearing up to go to war for real. Months on from the catastrophic attack at Pearl Harbor, the Navy, Air Force and Army were all ready to take the fight to the Japanese. The seemingly unstoppable force of the Empire of the Rising Sun was about to meet head-on the seemingly immovable object of the United States. The first target, however, was Tokyo, and in a similar fashion to their eastern enemies, the US was planning a sneak attack of their own, something that would require engineering skill as well as military know-how to complete. The tide of the war in the Pacific was about to change, but it was a long way from being over. The early months of 1942 didn't go well for the Allies. With British and resistance forces tied up in Europe by the Nazi war machine, it left Japan to spread the cloak of imperialism over most of Southeast Asia, granting them dominance in the Pacific. However, as their oil supplies dwindled, the Empire of the Rising Sun had struck out at their once main suppliers, the United States. While the initial raid on Pearl Harbor had taken the sleeping giant by surprise, it was an action that would eventually bring about the end of the war in this theatre, as the US began to bring to bear their own resistance to the Japanese across many Indonesian battlegrounds, before eventually taking the fight to the shores of Imperial Japan. However, this was still a long way off. Dominance on the sea had to be reacquired after much of the proud American fleet was decimated in the sneak attack at Hawaii. Fortunately for the Allies, though, 3 of their main aircraft carriers had been elsewhere, and they would eventually prove instrumental in turning the tide in the Pacific. As these were readied for the eventual counterattack, other US forces battled Japanese troops across the many islands of the Philippines, often losing. Allied naval forces in the area had been destroyed in a series of battles around Java, and with almost all neighbouring territories under Japanese control, the troops were now cut off from most of their supplies and surrounded by the enemy. This left Allied defences weakened, and meant that when the full scale of the assault was brought against them, there was little they could do. Suffering from sickness, malnutrition and combat fatigue, they were too weak to counterattack effectively, forcing their surrender. Some men did make an escape to the Corregidor Island in the south of Bataan, but they were swiftly pushed back by the Japanese troops, who forced them to the Malinta Hill. It wasn't long before the American flag was lowered, and General Jonathan Wainwright, commander in the area, accepted the surrender terms of General Masaharu. The Philippine Islands officially fell to the Empire of the Rising Sun on the 8th of May 1942. Another tragedy on a much grander scale was soon to follow, though, as with 80,000 Allied prisoners, the Japanese had to arrange transportation to prison camps. Imperial commanders decided to march the men over 60 miles to a railhead at San Fernando. This trek was soon to be known as the Bataan Death March, as it proved to be a terrible ordeal, especially for those malnourished or injured. Many thousands died along the way as a result of exhaustion, hunger, sickness and dehydration. On top of this, their captors, who saw surrender as an embarrassment, murdered many of them indiscriminately. Being relative newcomers to the Second World War, the American public and military were unprepared for the barbarism exacted by the Japanese during this march. However, while the suffering of the prisoners was horrendous, it galvanized the US into action. They had already decided that a counterattack against their eastern enemies was necessary. The question was how to do it. The problem now wasn't a moral one, but a logistical and engineering issue. Imperial Japan was almost 4,000 nautical miles from the naval base at Pearl Harbor, far too great a distance for Allied planes to make any sort of aerial raid. Despite this fact, though, this is exactly what the US military endeavoured to do. With such an ambitious project in mind, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, one of the most famous aviators and aeronautical engineers in America, had been chosen to plan and execute the attack. Over the years, Doolittle had won an array of awards for his achievements and had made many important contributions to aviation technology. But the task that lay ahead would be one of his greatest challenges yet. The main problem he faced was that America had no bases within bomber operating range of Tokyo, and although an attack could be launched from aircraft carriers, planes which were typically used with these ships would not be able to cause a great deal of damage. After long deliberation, an idea was eventually conceived to adapt giant B-25 bombers so they were light enough to take off from carrier decks. By the beginning of April, these highly modified planes were aboard the USS Hornet and on their way to the Pacific. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher captained the carrier from which Doolittle would launch his attack, while the task force would be led into enemy waters and protected by Vice Admiral William Halsey aboard the USS Enterprise. Typical of many wartime plans, especially the stealth kind, not all end up going to plan. As the Hornet and Enterprise ventured close to Japanese waters, they were spotted by a Japanese picket boat. This created a real problem, as the carriers were incredibly vulnerable to attack from land-based aircraft. Taking the initiative, Halsey made the decision to launch the raid early, despite the increased risk of pilots not being able to make it to Allied territory after dropping their payload. The aircraft had less than 470 feet of runway, and none of the pilots, including Doolittle, had ever taken off from a carrier before. In fact, no one had ever attempted to launch a bomber the size of a B-25 from the deck of a carrier before, making the task a challenge to say the least. But the rigorous training the volunteer army crews had received had clearly paid off, and all 16 B-25s, carrying their deadly payloads of incendiary bombs and high explosives, were launched successfully. Although the Japanese alert meant the planes were now setting off 180 miles from their original launch site, favourable weather would help them along the way, and the bombers would soon be closing in on their targets with Doolittle's plane at the helm. Six hours after takeoff, the planes reached Tokyo, and at noon they began dropping bombs on the capital and the surrounding areas. They met with little resistance, and the impact made was exactly what Roosevelt had hoped for. The Japanese were so shocked by the attack that high-level military commanders began blaming each other, and the mortified commander of Tokyo's air defense was shamed into committing suicide. In the meantime, Japanese fighter squadrons were returned home, and a carrier group was withdrawn from the Indian Ocean to protect home waters. However, while the desired effect of the raid was achieved, the aftermath was not smooth sailing for those that took part in it. Due to the extreme range of the bombing run, even the lightened B-25s were unable to make the return trip to the carriers. Add to this the near 200-mile addition of the early launch, and staying airborne long enough to reach safe zones in Allied China became near impossible. While Doolittle and others did make it to safety after being helped by Chinese resistance fighters and military personnel, not all would be so lucky. 2 crews were imprisoned by the Japanese after landing in enemy territory. 3 of these men would eventually be executed. However, they weren't the only casualties in the days after the raid. Angered by the attack and the help found by American pilots, the Japanese launched a massive retaliation campaign right into the heart of the Chinese peasantry, killing over 250,000 villagers. Such vicious retribution revealed just how much the attack on Tokyo had injured Japanese pride. And although the damage to Japan itself was not as severe as Doolittle had hoped, the fact that US bombers had reached the homeland at all would have a profound effect on Japan's decision-making in the next step of their Pacific War. Ultimately, the attack surprised Japanese officers immensely, with the commander of Tokyo's air defense being shamed into committing suicide. Those left were charged with planning the next move for the empire. 2 options became popular. One group favoured further raids into Australia, as they feared it would become an American military zone, allowing further attacks from their technologically equal rival. However, another opinion, championed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was more naval-oriented. He believed that the rapidly expanding empire needed to create a defence buffer against further attack, and that territory expansion wasn't strictly necessary at this time. Due to the new land they now held, Japan had a near limitless supply of resources to power their war machine. However, the supply routes between the occupied countries and their homeland needed to be protected. This wasn't the only thing to worry Yamamoto, though. The Japanese admiral was aware that the failure to destroy valuable carriers at Pearl Harbor had been a fatal mistake, and to ensure the survival of the empire and indeed of Japan itself, it was essential to finish what he'd started in December 1941 and complete the destruction of the American fleet. Yamamoto began to conceive a plan to lure US carriers within range of a Japanese task force for a monumental battle which would ensure Japanese control of the Central Pacific. He selected as his target Midway Atoll, two tiny coral islands which lay on the extreme northwest of the Hawaiian island chain. The American base here was far enough from Hawaii to lessen the risk of heavy land-based air power threatening Japanese ships. And not only would valuable US carriers be sent out to protect the atoll, if captured, Midway would further extend the Japanese defensive perimeter and even provide a useful base to launch attacks on the west coast of America. Yamamoto had, however, struggled to convince Admiral Nagano that an attack on Midway should take priority, and until April 18, 1942, preparations had been focused on advancing further south towards Australia rather than on destroying the American fleet. Despite Yamamoto's efforts, his plans were shelved, and the decision was made to not only attack Port Moresby, but to take over interim territories like the Solomon Islands in order to establish bases close to the continent for further advances. What the Japanese didn't realise, however, was that the Americans had cracked their codes, and as signal traffic was intercepted by US and British intelligence, Admiral Nimitz was informed of the imminent attack on Port Moresby. The news was treated very seriously by the American commander, who was aware that Australia would be left vulnerable if the Japanese established bases so close to the country. After consulting Admiral Ernest King, head of the US Navy, it was decided that the invasion should be opposed with all the aircraft carriers the Allied forces could muster. A fleet centred on two carrier groups was rapidly assembled and included Task Force 17, based around the carrier USS Yorktown, and Task Force 11, based around the carrier USS Lexington. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, who had already seen action in the Pacific after the Marshall and Gilbert Islands raid back in February, was placed in command of Yorktown and would also be in overall command of the mission. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch would command Lexington, and there would also be a joint Australian-American cruiser force to provide additional support. Task Force 44 would be commanded by Rear Admiral John Crace of the Royal Navy. As the ships headed towards New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, they would encounter many dangers along the way, with high seas and heavy winds to combat. But there was no doubt that every man on board was willing to brave the worst of storms if it meant he was given the opportunity to strike back at the Japanese. US forces didn't have to wait long for their taste of action, as on May the 3rd, news arrived that the Japanese invasion force had arrived at the Solomon Islands. The attack was being headed by Rear Admiral Shima, with other Japanese commanders handling the Port Moresby invasion and the carrier force. While Japanese troops began to pour onto Tulagi, Fletcher altered course to head due north towards the enemy, and on May the 4th, 60 aircraft were launched in 3 waves from Yorktown, taking Shima's forces completely by surprise. The attack was a success, and as well as hitting 3 minesweepers and 4 seaplanes, the Americans managed to sink an important Japanese destroyer. Nevertheless, the Japanese would continue to hold Tulagi as they set to work establishing a seaplane base on the island. After inflicting a considerable amount of damage on the Japanese fleet, Fletcher took his task force due south to meet up with Crace and Fitch's ships. But now the Japanese were aware of the presence of American carriers in the area. Eager to accomplish what Yamamoto hoped to do at Midway, it was now Admiral Takagi's turn to take part in the action. He led his carrier strike force from its position, 350 miles north of the Solomon Islands, and entered the Coral Sea to hunt for the Allies. It was a journey into the unknown, as the scene was set for the first ever aircraft carrier battle in history. It would later be described by a US commander as one of the most confusing battle areas in world history, as Japanese and American forces played cat and mouse with what could be considered each side's most valuable naval assets. In the build-up to the main conflict, the commotion amongst pilots for both armies was obvious. Planes would fire on their own forces, and some even attempted to land on enemy carriers. However, on the 8th of May, the decisive battle was fought, as American and Japanese fleets spied each other almost simultaneously. All combat planes were scrambled. By 9:25, all aircraft had been launched, and as the carriers headed for each other, Yorktown's strike force attacked at 11 a.m, to be met by 16 Japanese Zero fighters protecting the carrier Shokaku and her sister ship. While planes lunged and swooped through the air, avoiding anti-aircraft fire, Shokaku was hit by 2 1,000-pound bombs, which caused heavy damage to her flight deck, and before long, with further attacks from Lexington, she was out of the battle. But the Japanese soon struck back, and 14 planes swept in to attack USS Lexington in a pincer movement. She was hit twice by torpedoes before dive bombers moved in, hitting the ship again. Meanwhile, a bomb exploded on Yorktown's deck, but while Fletcher's carrier would survive another day, Lexington would not be so lucky. With a ruptured fuel tank, the carrier was doomed, and as a series of dramatic explosions detonated within the massive ship, over 2,500 men rushed to escape, with other Allied craft attempting to pull them to safety. Despite the Americans feeling that they'd come off worse in this conflict, both sides had suffered massive losses. The damage to their carriers halted the Japanese invasion at Port Moresby, and bought the Allies some much-needed time to repair and regroup. It wouldn't be the last major sea battle their forces would face in the coming weeks. Although Yamamoto's superior fleet admiral Nagano had finally agreed to the attack on Midway, there were still disagreements between the Japanese naval commanders. Nagano had decided that Yamamoto should launch a separate mission at the same time as the Midway battle, to capture some sparsely inhabited volcanic islands, which extended over 1,000 miles west of the Alaskan peninsula. The Aleutian Islands lay far to the north of Midway, and Yamamoto realized that the extra mission would extend his vast battle zone to unmanageable proportions, but Nagano would not be dissuaded. The Aleutian Islands appeared to have little economic, military or strategic value because of their barren mountainous terrain and harsh weather. But seizing them would further extend the defence of Japan, and make it harder for ships to slip through the northern Pacific. There was also the hope that launching this second attack far from Midway might serve as a distraction, leading some American ships north and therefore weakening the US fleet. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific Ocean, the US Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor had once again intercepted Japanese codes, and all Yamamoto's efforts at deception would be in vain. This also gave the US plenty of time to prepare, allowing them to turn Midway into a launching pad for their own attack into the heart of the Japanese fleet. Naval and air personnel were pulled from other commands, including forces from Pearl Harbor, as well as Fletcher's Task Force 17 from the Coral Sea. On top of these troop and equipment requisitions, Admiral Nimitz, who was in charge of the Allied defences, also requested the presence of renowned director John Ford and other photographers. They would go on to capture some of the most memorable footage of combat in the Pacific theatre. By May 30th, all US preparations were complete, and it was merely a matter of time before the Japanese attack force came within range. As the alarm rang out across Midway in the early hours of June the 4th, Nagumo ordered dive bombers, torpedo bombers and Zero fighters to launch their attack on the American base, and within less than 2 hours, the onslaught had begun. American planes, flown by Marine pilots, scrambled to intercept the attack and would destroy many of the enemy planes despite heavy losses. Meanwhile, as dive bombers from Nagumo's attack force swooped across the island, those defending the ground fought back fiercely. The anti-aircraft fire would prove much more deadly than the Japanese expected. Despite heavy damage to aircraft hangars and fuel storage depots, as the first wave of Imperial forces retreated, the Americans launched a counterattack, sending 2 torpedo squadrons heading straight for the Japanese carriers. Without fighter escorts, they were no match for the Japanese Zeros and were almost all shot down. But as the waves of American attacks continued, the Japanese were kept distracted. They were too busy focusing on the defense of their ships to launch a strike against the American fleet, and soon US planes had broken through Japanese defenses. The Enterprise Air Group hit 2 carriers, including Nagumo's, while Yorktown's bombers attacked a third. Before long, there was only 1 Japanese carrier still operational, and she counterattacked, sending a wave of dive bombers towards Yorktown. However, the Allied ship was far better prepared than her Japanese counterpart, and despite fires breaking out across the decks, they were controlled, and many of the enemy fighters were shot down. While a second wave of Japanese bombers headed for the American carrier, Rear Admiral Spruance launched a final strike on the Japanese fleet with 40 dive bombers. Within an hour, they found the last Japanese carrier. Despite several attempts to defend her, American planes delivered a deadly blow, which left her ablaze and sinking. As the smoke cleared and survivors were pulled from the water, it became clear that while Allied casualties registered in the hundreds, Imperial losses were in the thousands. Combined with the bulk of the Japanese carriers being eliminated, the Empire of the Rising Sun had suffered far worse. President Roosevelt himself congratulated those who had bravely fought off the enemy, clearly relieved that the American Navy had managed to deliver a decisive blow to their eastern enemies, checking their advance in the Pacific. While battles had been won on both sides, the war in this theatre was far from over. While the strength of their armed forces grew throughout the Second World War, bringing them to the forefront of modern military superpowers, the United States spent the first few years of World War II very firmly on the back foot. Surprised at Pearl Harbour, and though quick to retaliate, until the latter months of 1942, US troops fought a strong retreating defensive throughout the Pacific theatre. However, after the Battle of Midway, which saw the repaired and regrouped American fleet destroy most of the Japanese aircraft carriers and a large portion of their combat shipping, things started to change. The tide was beginning to turn, and for the first time, victory in all Allied theatres was possible, though there was still a long, hard fight ahead. The battle that would ultimately stick in the minds of many an American citizen and serviceman was the Battle of Iwo Jima. It marked a decisive victory for the Allied forces and one of many losses for the Japanese war machine, a level that simply could not be sustained. Before this battle could be fought and won, however, there were other territories to retake and some promises to fulfill. Resistance against the Axis was growing stronger by the day, and as battles intensified across the globe, it was a time of intense planning and strategizing for the Allies. Keeping the seaways open to move troops into position all over the world was of vital importance, and while the British Navy was taking a lead role in the North Atlantic, in the South Pacific theatre of war, US pilots and Marines were spearheading the Allied counterattack against Japan's drive for dominance. In New Guinea and the Solomon Islands north of Australia, Japan was now fighting a defensive war under the direction of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto had, unusually, studied in the United States. He'd even initially opposed the militarism that led Japan into war. But now he was a marked man for the Americans. It was he who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack of December 1941, and while the Japanese public still viewed him as a national hero, the Americans were keen to eliminate the man responsible for thousands of American deaths. In April 1943, the Americans decoded an intercepted radio message that revealed Admiral Yamamoto would make a flight in the Solomons on an inspection trip to his troops. The bomber carrying the VIP was to land on an island near Bougainville in the North Solomons. Seizing the opportunity, on April the 18th, 4 American fighter aircraft took off from Guadalcanal, following orders from President Roosevelt, and homed in on Yamamoto's flight path. The bomber carrying the Admiral was attacked and sent plummeting down into the jungle of Bougainville. Yamamoto's body was later recovered by a Japanese search party, but Tokyo did not announce his death until weeks later, for fear it would affect morale. Despite this moral and strategic victory, however, the Americans were likewise unable to announce the truth right away. Had they played their trump card here, they'd have revealed the ace up their sleeve, the fact that they had cracked the Japanese radio code. Keeping this secret alive let the Allies continue to lay bare the all-important plans of Japan's military, allowing for far more effective defensive and counterattacks from the Allies. The strike rate against Japanese vessels rose dramatically through 1943, as the Americans targeted both military and merchant shipping, and even fishing fleets. Slowly but surely, the Allies were gaining the upper hand in the stormy waters of the Pacific, and with General Douglas MacArthur at the helm as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, the Japanese were now facing a formidable enemy at sea, in the air, and on land. Taking control in the skies had continued to be a preoccupation in the South Pacific, where American and Australian forces were gradually making inroads along the southernmost perimeter of Japanese-held territory. One major target was the island of Rabaul, but it was very heavily entrenched with Japanese forces. To counter this, MacArthur employed an island-hopping strategy over the coming months. Instead of steamrolling his troops into the formidable Japanese defences, he utilised America's now dominant aerial and naval forces to move from island to island, defeating the weaker garrisons and isolating the stronger ones. This strategy worked very well, with more and more territory falling to the Allied advance. The Japanese were still firmly holed up in certain island strongholds, but even their strength on Rabaul wouldn't help against the superior tactics of the Americans. On the 1st of November, US soldiers from the 3rd Marine Division landed in Empress Augusta Bay on the Solomon Island of Bougainville. Backed up by an impressive US naval task force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, and commanded by the brilliant Rear Admiral Aaron S. Tip Merrill, the Americans quickly consolidated their position. The Japanese were equally quick to respond, launching air attacks from Rabaul as well as dispatching their own powerful task force of cruisers and destroyers. Merrill was the first American Rear Admiral to use radar, and in this battle it gave him a major advantage. Without radar, the Japanese commander failed to assess the outcome of the battle accurately when Merrill retreated under cover of smoke. Returning to Rabaul, the Japanese believed they'd been victorious and prepared to re-attack the Allied landing forces at Bougainville without realising Merrill's task force was still very much intact. 2 US aircraft carriers raided Rabaul on the 5th of November, and having underestimated their enemy, the Japanese fleet sustained heavy losses, which meant that any danger to the now well-established US Marines from Japan's Imperial Navy had for the time being at least passed. While America seemingly struggled alone against the entrenched Japanese, across the waters, the British had made headway in allying with Stalin, finally forcing a 2-pronged attack against Nazi Germany. This compounded the main problem which Hitler was faced with at this time, his steadily declining troop numbers. Having to occupy Italy, as well as coping with another bitterly cold winter on the Russian front, was spreading the depleted German military far too thin. With German intelligence recognising that an invasion by Allied forces in Western Europe was inevitably going to happen sometime in 1944, Hitler, just 2 days before the US raid on Rabaul, issued an order known as Directive 51. This gave a stark warning that anticipated a massive Allied offensive, giving his propaganda minister Goebbels one of his toughest tasks to date. With the threat of invasion hanging over them, he needed to convince the German people that the Führer and their nation were still invincible. Goebbels' personal diaries offer a fascinating insight, and on the day before Hitler issued Directive 51, Goebbels made an entry regarding the fact that more than 9,000 German soldiers had been killed on the Eastern Front in just 9 days. He said, "We cannot sustain such a drain for long. We are in danger of slowly bleeding to death in the East." Whatever the public face of Nazi propaganda, Goebbels, like many of his fellow high-ranking officials, was fully aware of the all-too-real danger of Germany being defeated. Without doubt, the Nazi propaganda machine was being stretched to the full by the events in Western Europe and Russia. However, the Japanese government was even more determined that the people of Japan should believe that their brave imperial warriors were victorious in every campaign of the Pacific Offensive. There were of course plenty of occasions when they did score direct hits against the Allies, particularly out at sea. On the 19th of November, the Japanese Navy sunk the USS Sculpin, a Sargo-class submarine. Appropriately named after a remarkably stealthy fish that can survive out of water as well as in it, and capable of inflicting a painful sting, the sinking of the Sculpin was a major blow to the American Navy. Yet the Japanese missed a golden opportunity to gain intelligence regarding the devastating attack the Allies were planning for the very next day on the 3 atolls in the Gilbert Islands, Makin, Tarawa and Abomana. Aboard the Sculpin was Captain John P. Cromwell, who'd been fully briefed on the offensive to take the Gilbert Islands, codenamed Operation Galvanic. This made him a prime target for the Japanese, who would have undoubtedly, had he been captured, been able to extract vital information about the operation via torture methods. Aware of this, when the submarine was first hit and the commander killed, Cromwell took the initiative to go down with the ship. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for devotion to his country and fellow servicemen. Silver linings like this were found in many small conflicts during the war up to this point. True victories were much harder to come by. However, things were about to change dramatically. Strategically, the Gilbert Islands were of vital importance as the Allies increased their operations from the mid-Pacific to the Philippines and prepared to advance on Japan. Taking the Mariana Islands from the Japanese would be crucial if the US Navy stood any chance of succeeding in this objective, but naturally, Imperial Japan was all too aware of this. Because the Marianas, including the all-important island of Guam, had become a major target, Japanese reinforcements had been drafted in, with fortifications consolidated to make the entire area as secure as possible. The Americans knew that they would have to advance island group by island group, because before they could even reach the Marianas, they would need to wrestle the nearby Marshall Islands from Japanese control. But before they could do that, the enemy garrison on the Tarawa Atoll needed to be neutralized. By now, the Americans had enough experience of the Japanese to come prepared, and as Operation Galvanic began on the 20th of November, over 6,000 US troops landed on Makin. On paper, the occupying army, made up of 300 Japanese soldiers and 500 Korean labourers, should have been easily defeated. But the battle was bitterly contested, and American casualties were high. It was a costly operation in other respects too, as the US escort carrier Liscombe Bay was torpedoed, killing 644 of the 900 crew. Then an accident aboard the US battleship Mississippi during the pre-landing bombardment of Makin, when the turret exploded, resulted in a further 43 American deaths. The people of Makin were nevertheless delighted to greet their US liberators, offering coconuts as a token of their gratitude. With Makin secure, American troops began their assault on Tarawa Atoll. Again, about 6,000 of them, but there were 5,000 Japanese soldiers laying in wait for them. With the odds much more even this time, the costs on both sides were all the more bloody. Over some 76 hours, more than 1,000 Americans were killed. However, these casualties were vastly outnumbered by their Japanese enemies. Of the several thousand that initially defended the island, only one officer and 16 of his men survived, along with 129 conscripted Korean labourers who'd helped make up the numbers. For the American people, who had so far been protected by heavy censorship, the now unrestricted news reports were hugely shocking. Many condemned Washington for allowing the offensive to go ahead after seeing photographs of America's brave young men floating dead in the water. The realization that the Japanese were going to put up a long and terrible fight really did hit home. With their experiences on Macon and Tarawa, the Americans changed their tactics when they reached Abamana. Despite the much smaller Japanese garrison, one Marine was killed within minutes during an attempted landing, so it was decided to settle for using Navy gunfire only to clear the army of occupation. It was certainly effective, but not in terms of direct hits. Because of the 25 Japanese defenders, only 14 had been killed by gunfire. The rest had committed suicide. While certainly small, victories like this were taking place for the Allies across the world. There were many major offensives like the bombing of Berlin and the continuing Italian campaign, but the little events were beginning to play a huge part too. In France, the resistance was undermining the German occupation at every turn, and with help from British agents, the preparations for the long-awaited invasion of the coast of northern France were piece by piece being slotted into place. Pulling all of the various elements of the Allied push for victory together was far from being an easy task. Meetings between the Allied leaders were incredibly difficult to orchestrate. A prime example of this was the Cairo Conference, held between the 22nd and the 26th of November. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and America's President Roosevelt met with China's Chiang Kai-shek to discuss the Allied position against the Japanese. Russia's Joseph Stalin refused to attend, as he believed, with the Chinese present, it would be viewed by the Japanese as provocation on the part of the Soviets. On the 27th of November, the Cairo Declaration was nevertheless signed by the three leaders present, stating that the Allies would continue to employ military force until Japan's unconditional surrender. It was also decided that when that happened, all the islands of the Pacific seized by the Japanese since the First World War would be taken back. All territories Japan had seized from China would also be restored, and last, but by no means least, Korea would become independent. With the Cairo Conference complete, Churchill and Roosevelt looked towards further discussions on the Allies' plans to invade France. While Stalin's absence from Cairo had been manageable, it was time for the Big Three, as they were so often dubbed, to meet as the Tehran Conference began. Stalin had not travelled outside Russia since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, but the three unlikely allies arrived in Tehran amid the tightest security to agree the plan for an Anglo-American cross-channel invasion planned for spring or summer 1944. The next 6 months of warfare are some of the most well documented in history, as the Allies planned and executed the massive invasion of occupied France, beginning with Operation Overlord on what would be known as D-Day. However, while there were certainly huge developments with the war in Europe, this wasn't the only theatre to see some impressive victories for the Allies. In the Pacific, MacArthur was making good on his promise to return to the Philippines that he'd made back in 1942. Despite a valiant defence of the area, MacArthur had famously been ordered to evacuate with his family and staff by Roosevelt himself. He had done so begrudgingly, leaving the troops on the ground with a phrase that helped rally them in the coming months: "I will return." He wasn't a man to go back on his word. This was the first of many Japanese strongholds to fall in the coming months as the US increased pressure on their enemies. They'd progressed far enough now to make direct assaults on Tokyo itself, dropping incendiary bombs onto the mainly wood-constructed buildings. This caused massive devastation, levelling many blocks of housing and war manufacturing plants. During one raid, over 325 B-29s were used, dropping magnesium, phosphorus and napalm into the packed housing districts. Ultimately, over 16 square miles of city were consumed by the flames, killing over 100,000 inhabitants who were simply turned to ash overnight. However, it isn't these devastating raids that are stuck in the minds of the American people, but the Battle of Iwo Jima, which saw the Japanese forces crushed in a decisive fight that would hail the beginning of the end of the war in the Pacific. 800 miles south of Japan, Iwo Jima was a mostly uninhabited island. At only 4 miles long and 2 wide, it seemed an odd place for such a battle. However, the Americans wanted it badly, in order to convert it into an airstrip for General Curtis LeMay's B-29 superfortresses and P-51 Mustang fighter escorts. The attack on Iwo Jima started with 10 weeks of heavy bombing and 3 days naval bombardment to break down Japanese defences. Then, at 2 a.m. on February the 19th, 1945, Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, began. As a storm of high explosives and steel lashed the island, 70,000 US Marines braced themselves for an assault landing, and just before 9 a.m, the first waves of US Marines hit the beach. Much to their surprise, they found no sign of the enemy, and for a brief moment they thought that the weeks of bombing and shelling had destroyed the Japanese defences. However, the reality of the situation was quite the opposite, and the massive American bombardment had left Iwo Jima's 23,000-strong garrison virtually unharmed, hidden away in an extensive complex of tunnels, bunkers, weapons pits and gun emplacements. Suddenly the air was filled with the thunder of the heaviest mortar and artillery fire that many of the American troops had ever seen, much of it from gun emplacements on Mount Suribachi. The scene was described by one reporter as a nightmare from hell. Nevertheless, despite the growing number of casualties, the American forces slowly edged closer towards the base of Mount Suribachi. This resulted in the containment of the Japanese troops defending the mountain, and on the 5th day of the invasion, February the 23rd, 1945, a Marine patrol managed to reach the summit and unfurl the Stars and Stripes. A short time later, 5 US Marines and a US Navy medic raised a second and much larger American flag over Mount Suribachi, and the dramatic photograph taken of the event was soon circulating around the world. It came to symbolise the raw courage of the US Marine Corps, but the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. 3 of the men in Joe Rosenthal's stirring photograph were killed shortly afterwards, as the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, reinforced by the 3rd US Marine Division, proceeded to clear the rest of the island. The Marines suffered extremely heavy casualties as they fought for Iwo Jima, quite literally, yard by yard. Over the course of a month's bitter fighting, the Japanese on Iwo Jima were gradually dragged from their underground hideouts, but it cost the lives of many Americans. On the 16th of March, Iwo Jima was declared officially secure, but another 5 days passed before the Japanese command post on the northwest side of the island was located and destroyed. Finally, on March the 26th, 1945, after 35 days of the bitterest fighting, the battle was over. However, even with the war slowly drawing to a close, there was still some of the bitterest fighting yet to come. Mainland Japan had yet to be conquered or subdued, and it was down to the brave men and women of the US Armed Forces to carry out this duty. Unfortunately for those involved, the last few months of World War II saw some of the bitterest fighting throughout the entire conflict. As Hitler's Nazi troops continued their retreating action into the heart of Berlin, the Americans were pushing back the heavily entrenched Japanese forces island by island, but with terrible losses. The final few battles for the Pacific and European theatres had been set up by years of battle around the globe, from the deserts of northern Africa to the muddy fields of Western Europe, and the cold Russian landscape to the humid jungles of Indonesia. There was war weariness the world over, and as the civilians of the once proud Axis nations continued to suffer at the hands of the now aggressive Allies, pressure was mounting in all corners for peace. However, it would take several final acts of destruction before this could be brought about. In Europe, the combined Allied forces were ensnaring Germany in a pincer movement from the east and west, forcing the last bastions of Hitler's defenders into their capital. The push was really gathering pace, and by April 1945, the empire that the Führer had promised would last 1,000 years seemed on the verge of collapse. There were also considerable advances being made in the Pacific, with the Americans preparing for Operation Iceberg. The target was Okinawa, only 340 miles from southern Japan, and the largest of the Ryukyu chain of islands. If an amphibious landing was successful, Okinawa would provide the Americans with a springboard for the final invasion of mainland Japan. Less than a week earlier, Iwo Jima, the first island in the Japanese archipelago to be invaded by the Americans, had finally been declared secure after 6 weeks of bitter fighting. Immortalised by photographs and film showing US Marines and a US Navy medic raising the Stars and Stripes on top of Mount Suribachi 5 days after the first landings on 19th of February 1945, the Iwo Jima fighting had cost the lives of 6,825 American and 21,703 Japanese soldiers. Although an Allied victory, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a chilling prelude to Operation Iceberg. For the invasion of Okinawa, the Americans assembled a force of 102,000 soldiers, 88,000 Marines, and 18,000 Navy personnel under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th US Army. Supporting Buckner's troops was a massive fleet of 1,600 ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 32 cruisers, and 200 destroyers. The warships lying offshore and carrier-borne aircraft were at battle stations, ready to blast Okinawa into submission. The bombardment of the beaches at Hagushi began at 6 a.m. and lasted for a grueling 3 hours. However, when soldiers from the 3rd Amphibious Corps stormed ashore, they found no opposition at all. Follow-up troops rapidly headed inland and had, by noon, taken the airfields at Kadena and Yomitan. By nightfall, the 10th Army had more than 60,000 men ashore, and the beachhead was now 9 miles wide. But the Japanese were nowhere in sight. In fact, Okinawa's Japanese garrison had positioned itself well inland to avoid American naval gunfire, many concealed in the caves of the island's rocky landscape. The Japanese 32nd Army defending the island was 120,000 strong, and 70,000 of them were regular army troops. They were good, battle-experienced men, but the remaining 50,000 were a mix of naval troops and locally conscripted islanders who were poorly trained and inadequately equipped. Even so, the Japanese had plenty of artillery, and the terrain without a doubt favoured a defensive position. At 60 miles long, being an average 8 miles wide, much of Okinawa was made up of hills covered with pine forests and thick undergrowth. Renowned for constructing strong and well-concealed defensive positions, the Japanese were ready and waiting for the enemy as the battle for Okinawa commenced. But by April the 3rd, the Americans had reached the eastern shore, effectively splitting the Japanese forces on Okinawa in two. General Buckner quickly initiated Phase 2 of his plan, the objective of which was to take the northern half of the island. The 6th Marine Division advanced towards the Motobu Peninsula on the western side of the island, where they encountered Japanese troops defending a natural fortress of wooded ridges and ravines. But by the 18th of April, the Marines had cleared the Motobu Peninsula. Most of the northern half of Okinawa was now in American hands. In the meantime, the Allied invasion fleet off Okinawa had come under a ferocious assault from the air. The Japanese High Command had assembled more than 2,000 aircraft on airfields in southern Japan and Formosa, today known as Taiwan, to disrupt the invasion of Okinawa, and despite bombing raids on their bases by American B-29s and carrier-borne aircraft in the weeks before Operation Iceberg, many were still ready for action. However, they weren't intended for standard bombing runs or escort duty. The aircraft were packed with explosives and aviation fuel, and were piloted by young men known as the kamikaze. They were well aware that their attacks were one-way trips, prepared to sacrifice their lives in order to do maximum damage to the American ships. Kamikaze meant divine wind, and was named after a typhoon that had destroyed invading Chinese warships in the 13th century. Japanese command hoped that their new divine wind of pilots would be able to destroy this modern threat. On April the 6th, 1945, the Japanese Operation Chrysanthemum began with massed kamikaze attacks on the Allied invasion fleet. Although fired up with fanatical devotion to their emperor, most of the kamikaze pilots were novices, and Allied fighters managed to shoot dozens of them down well before they had a chance to do any damage. But there were plenty of kamikaze who did succeed in breaking through, and for 2 days, anti-aircraft gunners on board Allied warships fought desperately to knock them out of the sky. An incredible 13 American destroyers were badly damaged or sunk, and it was a threat the Allies needed to take very seriously indeed. Over the next 3 months, several hundred more kamikaze pilots smashed their explosive-filled aircraft into Allied warships, with the vast majority being killed in the process. By the time the conflict on Okinawa came to a close, this type of attack had sunk 36 vessels and damaged another 368. The loss of American lives was even greater though, with 4,907 sailors killed and a further 4,874 wounded, all by kamikaze attacks. Despite these losses, survivors needed to prepare themselves, as the land battle for Okinawa was just beginning. The highest concentration of Japanese forces were to the south of the island, and on the 4th of April, General Buckner ordered the 24th Army Corps to advance in a southerly direction from the American beachhead. As the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions pushed on towards Shuri, Okinawa's ancient capital, they met fierce resistance from Japanese troops defending a position the Americans had christened Cactus Ridge. There was a bitter hand-to-hand struggle for Cactus Ridge, but by the 9th of April, the Japanese had been toppled from their vantage point, but at a high price, with 1,500 American casualties. But the way to Shuri was still barred by Japanese defenders along the Kazuku Ridge, and the fierce fighting continued until superior American firepower forced the island's defenders to call off further attacks. Even so, Buckner's advance had stalled, and the fight for Okinawa was anything but over. While the fighting across the island intensified, the war in Europe finally came to a close. On the 2nd of May 1945, the remaining German military, now without their illustrious Führer, capitulated to the Russians, sending a signal to all those involved that the end of the Second World War was in sight. Elsewhere in the Pacific, the British had forced their way through Imperial defences in Burma, finally taking Rangoon. The Japanese mainland was also being attacked with little opposition, and in the Philippines, American troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had managed to contain more than 200,000 Japanese soldiers on the islands of Mindanao and Luzon. Again, resistance was fierce as the Japanese fought bitterly to hang on to their mountain strongholds. But on the 26th of June, MacArthur was finally able to declare that the Philippines campaign was over. Ironically, it was also late June, the 22nd to be precise, that the Okinawa campaign was declared officially over. It had lasted a grueling 87 days, and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had perished in the fighting, with at least another 7,000, mostly local conscripts, taken prisoner. A further 100,000 Okinawan civilians are also thought to have died during the fighting. Although victorious, the Americans paid a terrible price, suffering more than 50,000 casualties with at least 12,000 fatalities. Figures like this really hit home that despite the war in the European theatre being over for more than 6 weeks, World War II was still very much continuing. The Japanese had repeatedly served notice that concluding the fighting in the Pacific was going to take all the Allies' resolve to see it through. However, there was an alternative to continued island-hopping invasions. A new technology was being trialled in the United States, one so devastating as to cause any nation it was used against to have no option but to capitulate. Secretly, since 1939, America had, in cooperation with the UK and Canada, been working on the Manhattan Project. Based on Einstein's work in nuclear fission, scientists had been diligently performing research with his theories, and on the 16th of July, a breakthrough was made. The atom bomb had been created, and Harry S. Truman, only in office for a few weeks, was now responsible for its use. Meanwhile, as war continued to rage in the Pacific, there was still no end in sight for the battles of the Far East. For the Japanese, to surrender was a fate worse than death, and driven by ancient traditions, they were determined to fight to the very last man. As Allied casualties continued to rise, and the United States prepared for their invasion of the Japanese home islands, there were soon grave decisions to be made. And in the final stage of the global conflict, steps would be taken to defeat the Eastern enemy, which would transform the face of war forever. However, the nuclear option wasn't the only one being considered. Throughout the spring of 1945, Allied troops had driven back the Japanese into the core of their home territory, making it possible for a full-scale invasion of mainland Japan. With this in mind, Plans were put together for a massive operation known as Downfall. Japan was an archipelago made up of thousands of mountainous and volcanic islands, making the invasion a daunting prospect. Of the 4 main islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu and Shikoku, there were few areas suitable for invasion. Only the beaches on the Kanto plain of Honshu, southwest and southeast of Tokyo, and the beaches of Kyushu presented suitable attack zones. The Allies decided that a 2-stage invasion should be launched, the first of which, codenamed Operation Olympic, would attack southern Kyushu. After building air bases here, cover would then be provided for the next step, Operation Coronet, which was the attack on Tokyo Bay on Honshu. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November 1st, 1945, and the combined naval armada would be the largest ever assembled in the history of warfare. 14 US divisions were scheduled to take part in the initial landings, and once the invasion of Honshu was underway, 25 divisions would be involved. The main concern for the Americans was the potential for huge casualty rates. The Japanese had demonstrated that they were willing to fight to the death if necessary, and there were also fears of biological warfare, which the Japanese had used during their war with China. It was estimated that there could be over 1 million US casualties during the attack. In the first 6 months of 1945, US casualties in the Pacific had exceeded those suffered during the previous 3 years put together, and put Allied commanders in no doubt that any attempt at invading the home islands would indeed lead to not thousands, but possibly millions of casualties. As Operation Downfall was begrudgingly put together, President Truman and his generals were faced with an incredibly tough decision. Commit the combined air, naval and ground forces of the American military to a long drawn-out campaign against an enemy that for all intents and purposes had lost but was unwilling to admit so, potentially losing hundreds of thousands if not millions of lives, or commit one of the most devastating acts of violence the world would ever see by using the atomic bomb. The latter option, while horrendous in its destruction, would shorten the war and massively reduce American casualties, which Truman was keen to do. The decision was made. As Truman began to make all attempts to exclude the Soviet Union as an invading force, the race for Japan was on. At 20th Air Force Headquarters in the Marianas, Curtis LeMay and his staff worked around the clock to devise a plan for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. The Soviets, in the meantime, were gathering forces on the border with Manchuria in southeast China, in preparation for their agreed invasion of Japanese territory, scheduled for August the 8th, exactly 3 months after the surrender of Nazi Germany. 2 days before the proposed invasion, the Allies received an inscrutable message from the Japanese Prime Minister. This was the final gesture of defiance for Truman, who ordered that a B-29 named the Enola Gay, after the pilot's mother, be loaded with the atomic bomb. It took off from the main runway on the island of Tinian and set off for its target, an important military centre called Hiroshima, civilian population 300,000. It was a calm, sunny Monday morning, and the city was bustling with activity, when at 8:15 a.m. the bomb was suddenly dropped. The devastation spread over 4 square miles, killing 30% of the population instantly. Humans and buildings alike disintegrated in the explosion, and the firestorm that ensued claimed many more lives. All that was left of Hiroshima by the time the smoke had cleared was a wasteland of flattened streets, many of its inhabitants now nothing but shadows, burnt into crumbling walls by the blast of white light. 4 hours after the attack, the Japanese government didn't know what had happened, and were only given some indication when a plane was dispatched to survey the city. A huge cloud of smoke was still rising above Hiroshima, but the true horror of the situation was only just beginning. The Japanese soon realised that this attack was far more devastating than any that had gone before, not simply because of the massive damage done to the city, or the fact that so many died in the initial explosion, but that there was little hope for any survivors in the area. Almost all those that didn't succumb to the initial blast were now dying in a much slower and painful manner, radiation sickness. While Japan reeled from the attack, President Truman made the announcement that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and sternly warned if the Japanese do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on Earth. 2 days after the attack on Hiroshima, the Soviets began to storm across the borders into Manchuria on August the 8th, ending all hopes the Americans had of keeping the Soviets out of the Pacific Theatre. But Tokyo still failed to respond to the call for an unconditional surrender, and on August the 9th, Truman carried out his threat by dropping another bomb on Japan, this time on the city of Nagasaki. As another city crumbled into ruin, the Japanese government and the emperor realized they no longer commanded the fate of their country. Faced with further nuclear attacks, Emperor Hirohito was forced to put aside any hopes of an honourable end to the war. The endurable must be endured, he announced, and finally, on August the 14th, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and agreed to unconditional surrender. 1 day later, President Truman made the speech that the world had been waiting for.
Forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
On August the 30th, US troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on a beach south of Tokyo, marking the beginning of America's occupation of Japan. And as US command was firmly established, the stars and stripes were triumphantly raised over the Japanese homeland. Representing the Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese Foreign Minister Shigemitsu formally surrendered for his country and committed Japan to the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. And when all the nations that had taken part in the Pacific battles had signed the document, MacArthur drew the war to a poignant close by saying,
"Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always."
The Second World War officially came to an end at 9:08 on September the 2nd, 1945. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Japanese now laid down their arms. On September the 4th, Imperial forces surrendered on Wake Island, 3 years and 4 months after the Americans had been driven from its shores. And so ended the largest conflict the world has ever known. Millions had died. Territory and cities were scarred from a conflict that raged for almost 6 years across many countries and continents. It was the dawn of a brave new world. And while we have echoes of this long drawn-out war even today, as long as we continue to remember the mistakes of our past, we stand a good chance of not repeating them.